When leaders rise to power on the back of grand slogans and fiery promises, people often rally behind the words rather than the weight of the policies. In the heat of elections, rhetoric shines brighter than reality, and the long-term consequences are rarely part of the public debate. The result is a politics of emotions where promise to make the nation great again overshadows the complex questions of how that greatness will actually be achieved. But when the dust settles, the real impact of such policies begin to surface, often leaving economies strained and citizens grappling with outcomes they never fully anticipated. And that is exactly what we have witnessed with the tariff policy of the Trump administration. What was once framed as a bold step to protect American jobs and industries, and it was celebrated with applause and nationalistic pride. But behind the applause, little attention was given to the long-term ripple effects, which are higher costs for businesses, pressure on consumers, and strain on America's own economic growth. The slogans sounded powerful, yet the reality of tariffs is now beginning to show cracks in the very foundation they were supposed to strengthen. Before we move further, let's first clarify what tariffs actually are. Tariffs are essentially taxes imposed on imported goods. The idea behind them is simple, that by making foreign products more expensive, government expect that people will turn to domestic alternatives, which in turn should boost local industries and create jobs. On paper, it sounds like a smart way to protect national interests. But here is the catch. The other country on which the tariff has been imposed is not the one paying these tariffs. It is the domestic importer who pays them to the government. And since no business wants to absorb extra costs, these tariffs get passed down to ordinary consumers in the form of higher prices. So instead of strengthening the economy, tariffs often end up fueling inflation, raising the cost of living and squeezing households even further. If tariffs had to be used at all, a smarter approach would have been to target very specific sectors where the domestic industry had the potential to grow but was struggling against unfair foreign competition. For example, tariffs could make sense in areas where critical national security industries are at stake, or in sectors where the foreign governments heavily subsidize their exports, creating an uneven playing field. Targeted tariffs on such goods could give local producers breathing space to innovate and expand. But instead of this careful, selective use, the US tariff policy under Trump was applied broadly, even on everyday consumer goods and essential inputs for US manufacturers.
I always say tariffs is the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary. And I was reprimanded by the fake news. They said, what about love, religion?
This not only failed to significantly boost domestic production but also made life costlier for American businesses and households alike. Trump's tariff policy was framed around ambitious goals like boosting local production and jobs, reducing America's trade deficit, gaining leverage in trade negotiations, and countering what he called unfair trade practices by China. These are objectives that might play out, if at all, only in the long term. But in the short term, the reality looks very different. Higher consumer prices mean people cut back on spending, which slows down demand across the economy. Businesses face weaker sales and higher input costs, leading to less expansion and fewer new jobs. The ripple effect spread further, which leads to reduced consumption, and it dampens the investment. The multiplier effect weakens, and instead of growth, the economy edges closer to recessionary pressures. And because the US economy is so deeply interconnected with the rest of the world, these shocks don't remain confined within its borders. They eventually ripple across global markets too. The International Monetary Fund has also issued strong warnings about the fallout of these tariff policies. Some of the concerns that experts raised earlier are now becoming visible in hard data. For instance, job growth in the US has been revised down by nearly 911,000, a staggering number that signals an economy weaker and shakier than many had anticipated. Trump's tariffs, once promoted as the shield for American workers, are now slowly filtering into consumer prices, adding more pressure on households. Beyond the US, the global impact is also clear. The IMF projects that the world trade growth will slow down to just 2.8% in 2025 compared to 3.3% in 2024, with US tariff policies being one of the major drivers for this deceleration. And instead of acknowledging these outcomes, Trump and his current administration have shifted the blame onto President Biden for the economic troubles. But the fact remains that the over-optimism on which these tariff policies were originally built has not translated into reality. The promised boom in jobs and industry has failed to materialize, and instead, the unemployment is climbing again, now reaching 4.3%. What was once marketed as the strategy to make America great again is increasingly being seen as a policy misstep that has left the economy more fragile than before. The tariffs have in fact also complicated the Federal Reserve's path forward on monetary policy. The Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the US, is caught in a classic dilemma. On one hand, control rising prices, it would normally raise interest rates to contain inflation. But on the other hand, with job losses mounting and unemployment ticking upward, the economy also needs lower interest rates to encourage borrowing, business expansion, and job creation. In other words, the Federal Reserve is being pulled in two opposite directions, which is fight inflation or support employment. This policy tug of war has created deep uncertainty in the economy, leaving both businesses and households unsure of what lies ahead. The only silver lining in this otherwise grim picture is that the US budget deficit for August 2025 fell to $345 billion, which is a 9% drop compared to August 2024. This decline was largely fueled by the surge in tariff revenues, and it is the direct outcome of Trump administration's trade policies. While this may look like a positive at first glance, experts caution that the tariff revenues provide only temporary relief. They are nowhere near enough to offset the large forces driving America's fiscal imbalance: soaring spending on social security, rising interest payments on public debt, and other mandatory expenditures. In fact, in July 2025 alone, interest payments reached nearly $61 billion, surpassing the total tariff revenue collected that month. This underscores the hard reality that the tariff may plug some gaps in the short run, but they cannot resolve the structural deficit challenges facing the US economy. Economists have always cautioned that tariffs come with heavy side effects, and you have seen that there has been higher consumer prices, supply chain disruptions, and the risk of retaliation from US trading partners, all of which could slow down the economic growth. This puts policymakers in a difficult position as they struggle to balance deficit reduction with the need to sustain economic performance. Experts warn that the risk of recession remain elevated, with the probability of US downturn climbing from 25% to 40%. In other words, what began as a strategy to strengthen the economy is now casting a long shadow over America's growth prospects. The claims of massive job creation and industry expansion through tariffs were always very unrealistic. Manufacturing in the US is inherently expensive. Wages are among the highest in the world, utility costs are rising, and the compliance with regulations adds further burden burdens. Competing with low-cost producers in Asia on basic goods was never going to be sustainable, no matter how high the tariffs. Instead of trying to revive industries that the US had already shifted abroad, a smarter strategy would have been to double down on areas where America holds a natural edge, which is advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and research-driven sectors. By strengthening innovation and high-value industries, the US could have reinforced its global leadership in the world economy, rather than chasing a return to the past that no longer fits today's competitive realities. In the end, the story of tariffs under the Trump administration is a reminder of how powerful rhetoric can overshadow economic realities. Promises of protecting jobs, reducing deficits, and reviving industries sounded compelling on the campaign trail, but the lived outcomes have been far more complex, and they are seen in the form of higher prices, weaker job growth, and heightened risks of recession. Tariffs may have delivered a temporary boost in revenues, but they have also strained consumers, complicated monetary policy, and shaken the global trade. For America, the real challenge lies not in looking backward to industries that can no longer compete, but in moving forward by investing in innovation, advanced manufacturing, and research-led growth. Only by aligning policies with economic realities rather than relying on political slogan, only then the US can hope to secure lasting strength in a rapidly changing world. That's it in this video. If you like the video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for content like this, and thank you so much for watching the video.